Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
I'm not sure if you've heard, but federal conservative leader Pierre Poilievre would really like to have an election.
Break the costly coalition with Trudeau to trigger a carbon tax election.
We will introduce a motion of non-confidence in the Prime Minister. It will read that the House declare non-confidence in the Prime Minister and his costly government.
We know the Conservatives say they want to sort of test the confidence of the House at their earliest opportunity.
Today, for the first time since the Liberals and NDP reached a supply and confidence agreement in March of 2022, Poilievre will get his chance to force a vote. The NDP ended that agreement earlier this month, so the Liberals can no longer rely on their support when facing a confidence motion. Naturally, with a chance to table one of those today, the Conservatives will do just that. Now, will it pass? Will the government fall? Probably not, but it could. Or it could the next time or the time after that, and I don't know if you know much about this Poilievre fella, but he can be pretty persistent. So, what happens today in Ottawa? What sort of politicking will it take to keep the Liberals in power or not? And what about next week or next month? I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Glen McGregor is a journalist who covers Parliament Hill and federal politics in Ottawa for CityNews. Hey, Glen.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on, Jordan.
You're very welcome. I'm just going to ask you right off the top, as we're talking here about midday on Tuesday, what do you think the chances are that the government falls on Wednesday?
Very low. Very little chance that's going to happen this week because we know both the leaders of the Bloc Quebecois and the NDP have said they are not going to vote in support of this conservative motion. And the government, to get through this confidence motion, really needs only one of those parties to vote with them. And it looks like both are going to vote with them. So this confidence motion is almost certain to fail when it comes up for a vote tomorrow. Although politics, anything can happen. You know, in theory, one or either of the parties could change their minds right up to the time of the vote. Both the NDP and the Bloc Quebecois, were they to vote with the Conservatives, then the government would fall. The Prime Minister would be obligated to go to the Governor General and tell her that he had lost the confidence of the House of Commons and could no longer govern, and that she must dissolve Parliament and trigger another federal election, which we'd be into very quickly. It would be up to the Prime Minister to set the timing of that election, but it would have to happen pretty quickly, so likely before Christmas. But as I say, I don't think that's going to happen.
At least not this week.
Yeah, it's hard to say what happens in the future because there will be other confidence votes, other confidence motions. The Conservatives use something called an opposition day to bring this motion. In the parliamentary calendar, the opposition are allotted by the government House leader a certain number of days to bring forward motions and debate any topic that they please. Conservatives chose to make this opposition day a confidence motion. Basically, the motion is very simple, plainly worded, saying that the House has lost confidence in the Prime Minister and his government.
So it's not attached to any legislation then. It is simply like, we're moving to kick these guys out.
Right. It's sort of a long list of complaints that they have with the government. In fact, when Pierre Poilievre got up in the House of Commons this morning to introduce that motion, he gave a speech. It really was kind of a campaign-style speech. It did, of course, refer to the carbon tax, which is what they had threatened to do initially, was to bring forward a motion specifically on the carbon tax. But they realized, the Conservatives did pretty quickly, that the Bloc Quebecois would not go along with that. Of course, Quebec is not covered by the federal carbon tax. They are one of two provinces, along with British Columbia, that have their own carbon pricing system. They have a cap-and-trade system in Quebec, and Bloc Quebecois leader Yves-François Blanchet says it's working pretty well, and why would we turn away from that? And we don't see any reason to bring down the government over a carbon tax issue. But the Bloc Quebecois has some other demands. One of the things they're actually asking for is increase to old age security and pension coverage. So they think that will help people in Quebec more than the rest of the country. The government doesn't really seem to be interested in doing that right now because they've already taken a bunch of measures to increase those payments in the past and really, frankly, don't have the money to fund a major increase in either of those two programs. So they're not interested in that. So that's why the language of the motion is very basic, bare bones phrasing of it, just saying a loss of confidence in Trudeau and his government.
And what exactly have the NDP and the Bloc said about why they won't vote against this government? They've both been heavily critical of it, as have most people in Ottawa that aren't Liberals.
I think the Bloc has been pretty straightforward and honest about the fact that they want to use this opportunity, that they now have leverage in the House of Commons for the first time in many years, and they want to use it in order to extract some concessions from Quebec, and they figure strategically it's not in their favor to do it. The NDP's reasons are a little bit different. And keep in mind, of course, that up until last week, the NDP was a signatory to this agreement with the Liberals called a supply and confidence agreement that would require them to vote along with the government to support the government on any matter of confidence, including motions like this or other things that are sort of naturally confidence motions, that is generally money bills. Anytime the government brings forward legislation that involves changing in the way it spends money or raises money through taxes, those are, by definition, confidence motions, and if the government loses a vote on those, then they fall. So the NDP tore up that agreement and said it was no longer going to guarantee its support, but it was going to do it on a one-off basis, case by case. So Jagmeet Singh looked at this one and saw what the Conservatives were trying to do here. Of course, Conservatives really want to have an election now. They look at the polls and show they're 20 percentage points about ahead of the Liberals and have been for some time. So they think the time is ripe for a federal election from the Conservative point of view. But Jagmeet Singh is saying publicly that he doesn't want to play political games like Pierre Poilievre does. He'd rather stay in Ottawa, stay in the House of Commons, and try and get things done for Canadians, as the cliche goes. But there is also reality for the NDP is they're probably not ready to go into an election campaign. They're not doing so hot. Public opinion research polling shows them in the low to mid-20s in sort of popular vote support. So they don't see any real advantage to going into an election campaign there. And there's also the question about the money the NDP has. Running federal election campaigns is an expensive proposition. It costs somewhere between $10 and $30 million, depending on how elaborate your campaign is. You have a leaders plane that crisscrosses the country. You got to pay for all kinds of television and radio advertising. So it's an expensive undertaking. And the NDP just hasn't been raising enough money. And in past elections, what they've done is repeatedly remortgage a building in downtown Ottawa called the Jack Layton building that was gifted to the party many years ago. And they've been using that as kind of an ATM to run their election campaigns. I think they like to stop doing that. And they just don't feel they're ready to go into an election just yet. So NDP support, Jagmeet Singh says it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, but the case, at least this week, is no, we're not going to support a non-confidence motion.
So what has Pierre Poilievre said about bringing this forward when both the parties have already said, listen, we're not doing it? How does he respond to that?
Well, he's frustrated, and he's frustrated with the Bloc Quebecois, and he's lashed out at Blanchet and, accuses him of being in league with the separatist party Quebecois in Quebec, which is having sort of a little bit of a resurgence politically. And in the NDP, he is even more pointed on his attacks against Jagmeet Singh, calling him sellout Singh, and quite openly suggesting that the only reason Jagmeet Singh is voting against the confidence motion is so the government will survive into next year, and that would give Jagmeet Singh the 6 years of service in the House of Commons that he needs to collect his full MP's pension.
That's quite an accusation.
That's a pretty serious accusation, and that's part of Pierre Poilievre's personal style, is that he likes to make personal attacks against other leaders or anybody he disagrees with, really, and try and put them on blast, leveraging all the social media that the Conservatives are so good at, and trying to kind of browbeat his opponents into agreeing with them. I don't think it's going to work here. And of course, the point about Jagmeet Singh's pension is that, of course, Pierre Poilievre qualified for his full pension a long, long time ago. He's been an MP since 2004, basically almost his entire adult life. He's been in the House of Commons. He will collect likely a much, much larger pension than most other MPs, save for Justin Trudeau. Of course, that doesn't get mentioned in the Conservative attack ads against Jagmeet Singh.
What's the vibe been in the House of Commons over the last week plus that they've been back? I mean, watching from afar, it seems pretty tense.
It is tense. And I can't say I've ever seen a time that I've been covering federal politics on Parliament Hill where you've seen such a cleavage between the Conservatives and the government of the day. There is a real animosity there between them. And I think it's a personal animosity, too, between Justin Trudeau and Pierre Poilievre. Usually in the House of Commons, party leaders tend to put on a show when the cameras are on and when they're speaking in the House, and it looks like it's a very combative situation. But generally, you'll see them later at the bar having a beer together. It's much more collegial, or at least it has been in the past.
Right.
I don't see that now. And I think a part of this is potentially driving Justin Trudeau's decision to stay on as Liberal leader and as Prime Minister, because he's been facing a lot of pressure, particularly because of those by-elections, the one in Toronto in June in Toronto-St. Paul's. Liberals should have won that riding handily. They lost it in an upset to the Conservatives. And then last week on the island of Montreal, a riding called LaSalle-Aymard-Verdun, which had been safe Liberal seats in the past, previously held by the former Justice Minister, David Lametti. Before that, Paul Martin, former Prime Minister, also represented that seat. So this should have been safe Liberal territory. They lost that narrowly to the Bloc Quebecois. Unusual because the Bloc doesn't usually do very well on the island of Montreal and in Montreal, the city proper. They tend to get their support from rural regions and other smaller towns and communities across the province. So that was a real shock, and that really kind of increased the calls on Justin Trudeau to consider stepping down for the good of the party. But when he explains it, he often talks about how he thinks he's the best person to take on Pierre Poilievre. And I think, honestly, it has become personal for him. I think the attacks that Poilievre has made against Trudeau's character personally have really rankled him. And I think he absolutely wants to stay and run against him. So I think the lack of harmony and incivility in the House of Commons is carrying over into the Prime Minister's decision to fight another election campaign.
Speaking of the Prime Minister, what, if anything, has he said about the coming confidence motion and, just in general about where the Liberals are right now while all of this is going on in Ottawa? Justin Trudeau was talking to Stephen Colbert on Monday night.
Yes, and he repeated a variation of the answer that he gives to that question every time. When he was on the Colbert show, and of course, Colbert didn't actually ask him whether he was going to stay on another election campaign. He was asked Trudeau sort of a general question about the rise of nationalism or populism you've seen in the Western countries, including in Canada and the United States. Didn't mention Pierre Poilievre by name, but it's pretty clearly what he was referring to. And Trudeau took the opportunity to say that he understands why Canadians are so frustrated, talking about the affordability crisis, the housing crisis, the fact that, we're still kind of coming out of a pandemic now. We haven't fully emerged from that, still dealing with the lingering effects of it, both socially and economically. And he says it's only natural that people would blame him, that would kind of target him with their criticism. So it was fairly kind of a little bit eye-opening. It was an answer he hadn't given. I haven't heard him given other journalists before, and it was illuminating in that respect. That's kind of an interesting thing about when politicians go on to do media events with people who are not journalists. Of course, a journalist was interviewing Trudeau who had asked that question emphatically, are you going to run? Why are you going to run again? But instead, when you have going on a late night show with a comedian, you don't know what kind of questions you're going to get. But I think it was kind of an interesting response that Trudeau's sort of a level of self-awareness that he has, that he knows how personally unpopular he is. He can read a poll like anybody else. He's seeing all the headlines every day that say Canadians are tired of him and want to change. But he is resolute so far, standing firm in this idea that the message that he's going to keep delivering is that I feel your pain. I understand why you're upset. I understand why you're concerned, why you're frustrated every time you go to the checkout at the grocery store or have to pay a mortgage that's a lot higher now than it used to be. So I think that's kind of the way he's going to do it, is through expressions of empathy. Will it work? Pollsters suggest no, it's not going to work.
Assuming that it does not pass and the government does not fall, you kind of alluded to this earlier. We just do this again next week and then the week after that and the week after that until it does? Or what's the plan here?
Yeah, so there will be a certain number of opposition opportunities for these opposition days to bring motions of non-confidence. And I would expect the Conservatives will do it again when they think it's strategically more likely to succeed than it was this week. When that will be, it's hard to say. It'll be interesting to see when the government, they haven't said they're introducing a fall economic statement yet, but they always do. So this is kind of the mini budget they release before Christmas.
Right.
The date bounces around a fair bit. Sometimes it's in September, October. Sometimes it's not until early December. But I imagine they will do that. And then the votes that will follow that, because it is very likely to be something that is going to spend money or impose some kind of taxation changes, then this will be a matter of confidence. There are other pieces of legislation that are still bobbing around, kicking around through the House that will also be confidence motions. Remember changes to the capital gains rules that were controversial. Those things could come up for votes in the House as well, and those would be confidence motions. So the government is on pretty thin ice for the next few months with having lost this deal with the NDP to automatically support them. But the thing they have going for them, the government does, is that the NDP really wants to see follow through at the legislative front on things like pharmacare. That pharmacare bill, of course, is kind of stuck in the Senate right now. Will be coming back to the House of Commons at some point. The NDP wants to see that expanded because this was one of their conditions of the supply and confidence agreement, was that the government would start the ball rolling on what is truly a national prescription drug benefit program.
Right.
And what the government has offered so far is fairly small ball, covering prescription birth control for women and also insulin and other supplies for people who needed to treat the diabetes. So that's a good step in the right direction, but the NDP doesn't think it's going to go far enough. Also, the dental care program, to get that fully phased in. Right now, it's covering younger people and seniors, but the working poor, people who have jobs, who are over the age of 18 and under the age of, I believe it's 65, those people don't have dental care through employer programs. So the NDP wants to make sure that that program is fully launched, available to everybody before they pull the plug on this government.
So what could actually trigger the Bloc in particular, but also the NDP, to vote against this government with the Conservatives? Have they said, like, if they do this, then this? What's the line?
Both Jagmeet Singh and Bloc leader Yves-François Blanchet are playing it pretty close to the vest in terms of specific requirements to continue to support the government. They are truly taking it on a case-by-case basis. And the reason for that is just simple strategy. I mean, they think this is a better approach for them. They can leverage more, get more concessions out of the government in its dying days than if they put out a list of demands and said, meet it or don't. They're going to be more flexible about it. And they're also looking at their own political timing, right? I mean, we're into a bunch of election campaigns right now in this country. Of course, British Columbia and New Brunswick are into election campaigns. Mm-hmm. Ontario could potentially go into another election campaign at some point. Saskatchewan, the same. And this kind of informs the federal calculus too, because generally Canadian voters tend to elect, and it's not an absolute rule, but it's something that we've seen in the past repeatedly, voters tend to elect different governments at the provincial level than they have at the federal level. So in Ontario right now, of course, you have a progressive conservative government led by Doug Ford, and you have a liberal government led by Justin Trudeau. So were either of those things to change, there might be a different calculation. I mean, there's a thinking that the federal Conservatives wanted to go now because if Doug Ford calls an election sometime in later this fall or into the new year, then they're concerned that anti-Trudeau sentiment that Ford would probably be relying on for some votes wouldn't be available to the federal Conservatives if they were to go after. There's all those kinds of calculations that every party is doing their own math on this, trying to figure out when is the best time for them to go into an election campaign. When do they have the best chance to improve their standings? I think Blanchet, he's looking at what's going on in Quebec. He feels like his party would do pretty well right now if we went into a federal election campaign, could potentially even win the right to be the official opposition were we to have an election right now. That is that the NDP and the Liberals would finish third and fourth in an election campaign behind a Conservative majority. And that would be just fine for Blanchet because he doesn't have any aspirations to form government. All he wants to do is present a strong opposition. So if you become the official opposition, as the Bloc has in the past during the Chrétien years, they get more resources, they get more money basically to sort of conduct their daily activities. So a lot at play for each of the parties. They're all doing these complicated calculations, trying to figure out when is the right time. Honestly, if I was to put a bet on it, I mean, potentially mid-October, things could change. Blanchet has hinted at that in interviews in the past. But then we don't know about the timing of an election after that either, because, of course, that would be up to the Prime Minister.
Well, they don't want to stick Canadians with a Christmas election, do they?
Well, no, I would think not. You remember back in 2005 when the Paul Martin-led Liberal government fell on a confidence motion, and we were into suddenly an election campaign in the fall, the writ period has to be 36 days between the time government is dissolved and Canadians cast their ballots. But it can be longer. And that's what Paul Martin did. He extended it into January of the next year. So we had this weird situation where all the parties were campaigning right up till Christmas time, took a break, and then came back and started campaigning again. Ultimately, the Liberals lost that election. Stephen Harper won his first government, a minority, and that led to 9 years of Conservative Party rule.
Last question then. Aside, obviously, from the numbers and the result of the vote today, what will you be watching for from this confidence motion?
I will be watching those other parties, what Blanchet and what Singh are looking for into the future. Are they looking for other concessions, specific concessions? Because the NDP has been the Liberals' lifeline all throughout this. But now that they've torn up that lifeline and they now have potentially a little bit more power to exert in extracting some new concessions, what other things would they like? They've already got the federal government to agree to essentially anti-scab legislation, preventing the use of replacement workers in federally regulated workspaces. They've got the dental care done. They've got other concessions on housing, which the government might have been doing anyway. I'm curious to see what Jagmeet Singh puts next on his wish list when we get through this vote. He might very well say, okay, we supported you now, but we want to see action on this specific policy issue. And if you don't get it, then the next confidence vote, no promises. We don't know if we're going to support you or not. It will be interesting to see also if any Liberal MPs show any signs of wavering. It'll be interesting to see who doesn't show up. It'd be wildly unlikely for a member of the governing party to vote against its own government. That's not going to happen. But you might see some MPs who sort of express their opinion by not coming to vote. Shouldn't make a huge difference. Really, this confidence motion is, as I say, very likely to fail unless we get some final flip-flop from either Blanchet or the NDP. But it would require, of course, both of them to flip-flop, which seems even astronomically unlikely at this point. So it's going to be an interesting couple of weeks and months heading up to Christmas, let's put it that way. We can't really say at this point, even though we know this motion is going to fail on Wednesday night, we can't really say when the next one's going to come and what the outcome will be. It's all kind of up in the air right now.
Glen, thank you for breaking this down for us. Really helpful.
My pleasure. Thanks.
Glen McGregor, covering Parliament Hill for City News. That was The Big Story. For more from us, head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can offer us any kind of feedback you like by emailing hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or by calling us at 416-935-5935 and leaving a message. The Big Story is available in every podcast player you like, including Seeker, Seekr. If you haven't checked it out yet, give it a try. And it's on your smart speakers. Just ask them to play The Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.